thank you, Chairman Estrada, and to the whole board. Really appreciate your having me and inviting me. And I'm glad to see that you're holding this series of presentations on long-range planning and thinking in terms of long-range plans. So today I'm going to talk about climate change and in particular focus on sea level rise. And unfortunately, my message is going to be that sea level is going to rise higher than you think. The challenge is going to increase faster than you think, and there are more things threatened than you think. But there are actions that we can take about each of those challenges, and that's why we're here. So, beginning with higher, and I'm going to give you a kind of a really big picture, because look, this is one of the biggest concentrations of roads and transit in the country, right? If any place can think big or be a model, I think it's here. So I'm going to give you the real deal in terms of how much sea level rise we can actually expect over time. And I am going to talk about longer time frames, even than this long range plan you're discussing, but I think it's useful for a few reasons. I'm going to start with this really interesting public art installation that was put in Paris in December 2015 for the International Climate Talks. It's called Ice Watch. Those are 12 kind of iceberg chunks towed from the Greenland, floating off of Greenland, towed to Copenhagen, driven to Paris. And so I guess the idea is it represents time, and over time you watch the ice melt. To me, it represents a very simple but profound truth about sea level rise, which is that ice does not melt right away when it's in warm conditions. It takes time. So if you have a freezer full of ice and you unplug it, it doesn't all turn to water right away. It takes time. So what does that mean? Well, we've already warmed the planet by more than 1 degree Celsius. Probably actually a little, around 2 degrees Fahrenheit, a little more. But the glaciers melting, the ice sheets melting, have barely just begun to respond to that warming. There's a lot more sea level rise in the pipeline if we stopped polluting tomorrow. In fact, if we stopped polluting tomorrow, I think we could expect about 6 feet of sea level rise. Now, so you can just, in all of your planning, whatever projections or numbers you see, just guarantee there will be 6 feet. And if we go on to meeting the targets in the international agreements, 1.5 degrees, very optimistic, 2 degrees is still quite a stretch given our current path, we can expect that we will be locking in 12 feet, 20 feet of sea level rise. Now, that will take a long time to happen, centuries, okay? So, it's not your long-range plan for 2050, but it is coming. It's much easier to project the amount of sea level rise than the pace. That freezer I unplugged, any one of us without a degree could tell, would know it's all going to melt. Now try asking, well, how many ounces will melt per minute? And what minute will it finish melting? Much harder. And that's what most of sea level science and projections are involved with. When you get projections and you're trying to base your plan on projections, we're trying to figure out how much is melting per decade, much harder. So we're doing our best. But I guess if you take one thing away from this presentation, I'll just kind of lead with it, is everything you do to prepare for higher sea levels will not be in vain. Those higher sea levels will come. And also, everything you do will just be the first step in a journey. It will not be the solution, right? Someone might say, well, you have to plan for 2 feet of sea level rise. Great, plan for 2 feet of sea level rise, but know that your successor will have to plan for 3 or 4 feet, and her successor will have to plan for another couple feet, and so forth and so on. So if you're getting a right of way to, I don't know, build a berm, that right of way might need to be a little wider, and build a small berm right now costs less, it's all you need. I mean, who plans for 100 or 200 years? But you will need a higher berm in the future. So it's just something to tuck away inside. Ice melts when it gets warmer, but it takes time. Now, climate has been pretty stable for the last few thousand years, and the ice on the planet has been pretty stable until the last century. And here's just a quick visual illustration of melt on one glacier in Alaska across 60 years. Here is a look at 2,000 years of sea level rise by century, so you can see a very distinct uptick. We're still measuring sea level rise in inches last century, but it's switching to feet. Here is a look at temperature over the same period, same time scale, so you can see a nice correspondence, or not nice correspondence, of the sea level increase in temperature. That's pretty clear that should be. Carbon dioxide obviously spiking, and now we're looking over a much longer period. And just to kind of bring home this long-term commitment, this shows 400,000 years of carbon dioxide, temperature, and sea level marching more or less in lockstep. But the important thing to note is that carbon dioxide has shot way up, and in the next panel in red, temperature has just started to respond, and in the next panel in blue, sea level hasn't yet started to respond in any perceptible way in this. The big jump you see in sea level, that ended like 5,000 years ago. We had 400 feet of sea level rise between 20,000 years ago in the Ice Age and 5,000 years ago, because there was a warming. But we've been stable for around 5,000 years until that last uptick that I just showed. So that's to reemphasize, there's a lot baked in that's coming. We can make a big difference by cutting climate pollution, by the way, and how much we'll see by the end of this century and in the future, and how fast it will come. We can make a big difference and reduce the problem, but a lot is baked in, and you are charged with the serious business of protecting our transportation system, so it's coming, and you have to be prepared. All right, now I'm going to just share here's a look. Here's this general area, current coastline. Here is a fairly low projection of the sea level rise already locked in blue. So current coastline, 1 degree Celsius warming. That's what's coming. Here's 1.5 degrees. That is better than anyone thinks we'll do. Here's 2 degrees, the main Paris target, with all of Hoboken below water. And most people find that pretty ambitious. Here's 3 degrees, which is closer to our current path. There's 4 degrees, which we could also be on a path for. All that's in Celsius, scientists speak. Here's a look in Google Earth at the airport in the present. 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees. Just to give some perspective on the whole transportation infrastructure. So that's higher. What about faster? Here's a look at the tide gauge water levels at the Battery of Manhattan over the last century plus. You see a pretty gradual pace of sea level rise, pretty steady. Globally, there was slower sea level rise in the 20th century, around half an inch per decade, but now we're north of an inch per decade in this century, and with continued acceleration. But you see this steady line, even over the last 50 years. Compare that to the rate of coastal floods and coastal flooding. And this is a graph for Atlantic City, which I know is a little south of the MPO, but it's illustrative. Even when you have a fairly steady, slow sea level rise, the number of times that the frequency of flooding above a particular threshold, and in this case that threshold is what the National Weather Service defines as a flood, a minor coastal flood, because some roads are flooding, some infrastructure is flooding. That can rise much more steeply. I don't want to get into the math of that, but I guess think of it this way. If you're at the edge of the ocean on the beach standing with your bare toes and the waves are lapping up to you, but they're getting to an inch away, wave after wave, but they're not getting you wet, right? You only need a few inches for the tide to come in until you're getting wet on every wave, right? So you can go from very rarely getting wet to very frequently getting wet with a very small change in sea level, and that in effect is what you're seeing on a different scale in this graph, an exponential increase in flood rates in Atlantic City, and we're seeing that farther north as well. Similarly, this chart looks at the projected frequency of floods above 5 feet. That's how high Irene got. And obviously Sandy got a lot higher. And this is for a medium kind of rate of sea level projection, and you can see towards the middle of the century, we start doubling the annual chance of floods at 5 feet every decade, right? So it grows slowly until it shoots up, and you have a couple decades that are horrible. And that happens, if I were to show you the graph for 4 feet, it would happen, it would look similar, except everything would be shifted maybe 10 or 20 years earlier, right? So it goes like that. Here's a look with a faster sea level projection. So slow sea level rise can still translate to a fairly rapid change in the frequency of flooding of some critical assets in the system. And I'm showing you material taken from an online tool that we have that you can explore called riskfinder.org. We've got analyses like this for every county in the state, every city, in fact, the MPO itself. And here's just an excerpt from a recent paper that a colleague and I wrote, which shows the same thing, but integrates the frequency of flooding with kind of where stuff is built. So here, you look in the middle row in the far right panel, it's a picture of the exposure of roads to potential flooding in Hoboken. And you can see by mid-century, we're projecting under the red line a high sea level rise scenario, a high emissions scenario. About 40% of the road miles are going to be below the top flood level each year on it in this projection. Actually, we've just been developing a capability to do this. So if you have a portfolio of 100 assets or 1,000 or 10,000 with latitudes and longitudes, we can produce basically the expected number of times that any of those assets, that coastal floods will reach higher elevations than any one of those assets. So you can index all of those assets in terms of their relative coastal flood risk very quickly. So more stuff. I don't have to tell you, there's a lot of stuff on vulnerable low-lying land. Here again is just a map, one of our websites, ss2.climatecentral.org, showing again this 5-foot level. And now we can get into how much stuff is below that level. For New Jersey State as a whole, it's more than 2,000 miles of roads, more than 100 miles of rail. And in fact, I might try and do a magic trick here and see if I can, I'm going to just go to the live thing because If you come to Risk Finder, you can type anything you want. Here's a look at New Jersey, and this is like a secret back door here, but I'm going to come down and look at here's different counties with your mapping population, and look at lots of other variables, but I'm going to go New Jersey by Metropolitan Planning Organization. So here is our analysis for and I'm going to click on North Jersey, and so here we are, NJTPA. We already did the analysis for you guys, actually years ago, and we can scroll down to see what is at risk. Well, here's population, and now let's look instead at infrastructure. So it's 1,000 miles of roads below 6 feet. On another level, having a problem. There we go. 5 feet. Okay, 900 miles, 5 feet. 79 rail miles. We can look at transit. 17 transit passenger stations. 15 ferry stations. 13 intermodal freight terminals. So we got a ton of stuff in here, and I invite you to use it. The same thing is true for all of the counties and cities represented here, the same kind of panel. You can explore, and then you get a map. I'm going to flip back to the main presentation and just kind of zip through here. I've shown you the ideas here, just to show you we get down to about zip code level within a county. So you can look at different areas here in Hudson County, railroads, transit passenger stations. And you can download all of this, make your own PowerPoints, or even get individual facilities listed. Now, we did this with federal data, so you have better data about your stuff and where it really is. And we can talk if you want a similar analysis. Finally, on the sea level front, I recently published with colleagues at Rutgers an analysis looking at accessibility to employment based on roadways which be flooded and how flooding changes accessibility. Because it's not just what gets flooded, but it's also about can people get to where they, even if my place of living and my place of work are not either flooded, but the way to get between them is, that's a problem. So the red here just colors different roads which are below the different water levels indicated. And then we do an analysis of the % reduction in job accessibility. So we did this research in southern New Jersey. It was just a case study, but it's a kind of analysis that's possible. Of course, these different numbers could represent a very transient flood, or over time, a permanent situation, sea levels rise and tide levels rise. And here's just a closer look at the kind of real-world correspondence. Sometimes you get just one spot on one road, which has a major impact on accessibility for a particular community. Finally, it's not just sea level rise, of course. That's my emphasis here. Sea level rise is coming, but there are advantages and disadvantages. It's relatively slow, but it never goes away. It's going to be permanent. We could have an awful rainstorm next week, and we're having, fortunately, they come and go, and that's, maybe more of a one-time preparation, right? Hardening or I won't say hardening, but rather designing infrastructure to withstand really significant downpours. And as you can see, the wettest day of the year has been steadily increasing in this area over the last 70 years, although with a lot of noise besides that signal. And of course, it's getting warmer, and we're seeing more and more heat records and fewer cold records per year. per decade over the last century, and more days above critical thresholds. So to the extent that materials for roads or rails or other places have performance issues when you exceed a particular heat threshold, I think that is going to be very much an increasing concern. So a lot of troubles unless, right, there's a lot that a group like this can do. So I'm really grateful for your time and attention, and I'm hopeful that you will take this very serious change that's happening quite seriously as well. So thanks for your time, and if we have time, I'd be delighted to take questions.
Sure. Are there any questions from the members? Any questions from the members of the board?
So, I mean, you're listing specific points of infrastructure that are at risk of failure, right, or permanent inundation.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily, I'm not making a judgment as to whether they'll fail or not.
Right.
And when we look at points of infrastructure that are below, say, 5 feet, 5 feet means different things. Like 5 feet this year means, maybe a 1% chance of a flood that high. 5 feet at the end of the century might be below the high tide line. So, and in between those points, it becomes more and more frequent flood risk, and that flood may or may not be disabling for that facility.
Right. Have you considered sort of ranking certain points of failure based on likelihood of passing permanent tipping points? So, like the portal to a tunnel, right? There is a permanent tipping point, and it could be a half an inch, right? So that sort of resonated with me with some of the things we were discussing, is that you're okay until you're immediately not okay.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if your group is thinking about potentially looking at the most major critical points that could reach these tipping points earlier, and whether or not we as an organization focus on those. And one of them that comes to mind is the yet to be built Gateway Tunnel.
Yeah.
Right, which if we're not building it to last at least 100 years, what are we actually doing if we're planning on spending $15 billion on it?
I think actually there's, you raise a great point about the time frame there, because often I read about people saying, well, we're planning to build something. What is the design life of this thing? Let's look at the projection between now and the design life. And then I look around at the infrastructure we have, and everything is like at double its design life. Like we haven't built something new or thrown that thing out. So, and then also consider if you build a new train station or tunnel entrance or a major piece of infrastructure, it creates inertia. Like other stuff is going to get built around it. Population, there's going to be more, right? So it's really a much longer term picture when you cite a new project. And so I think it is appropriate to take these much longer term considerations, these longer term projections into consideration. As for whether we need an evaluation based on these critical points versus, say, a stretch of road, we don't currently. We don't have that expertise, but that's where really we rely on, or can rely on, entities like you, right? If someone came to us and said, look, here's a list of assets, and here are the ones on the red list, and here are the ones on the, that they can handle frequent flooding list, right? It's easy then to do analysis on those different groups, but we would, we're not experts in transportation infrastructure. We would need that input from someone else.
It sounds like a good study for the UPWP.
Sure.
Thanks.
Any other questions from the members of the board? Any questions from the members of the audience about the issue that Dr. Benjamin stressed?
trying to be important. One thing
Sir,
that-
there's a mic right next door to you.
Oh,
there.
okay. As oceans warm, and I know you've taken that into consideration, you know, your water expands as it gets warmer. I'm sure that is, but we actually have a conference next week in Miami about talking about electronic trucks, you know, electric trucks and cars. What's the net result of that? I mean, is there, as we become more, if we have a big surge in electric over-the-road tractor trailers and electric cars, is that good or bad? What's the net result on that?
Well, the net result of that will be a reduction in climate pollution and reduction in you know, other forms of air pollution, quieter roads, a lot of, you know, less grime covering stuff, less oil slicks on the road. So a lot of changes. You know, it's part of the long-term picture in terms of reducing climate pollution and ultimately slowing and reducing the total amount of climate change. One of the issues that comes with frequent saltwater flooding of roads is, and they see this in the Keys in Florida, actually a lot, like all their cars rust out within a few years because they're always driving through shallow saltwater and splashing that up on the undercarriage. I have no idea whether that's a bigger issue for electric cars or not, and in any event, it's not a situation that anyone wants to sustain. But basically, electric vehicles are helping to fight this problem, and so it's part of the solution.
Any other questions from the audience in reference to Dr. Krause's presentation? Doctor, thank you very, very much. I think if anything has opened our
And
eyes.
I saw one more down there.
Sorry, it's a little
Ms.
late.
Patel, I'm sorry.
Just curious, outside of the transportation industry, there have been reports and things out that say like agriculture and land use are bigger contributors, negative contributors for climate change than the transportation, all of the transportation industry combined. Have you seen at the national level with like big agriculture and things like that, any policy changes to shift some of the trends in land use, or with agriculture, which is the largest land use portion of the United States, to combat some of this?
Yeah, so the question was about agriculture versus transportation as contributors to climate pollution, and there are lots of different ways you can divide the pie of our total climate pollution, and I don't want to get into it, you know, is transportation bigger or agriculture bigger? They're both very big, and they both can be part of the solution. So for agriculture, you know, one challenging thing is if the national diet became less meat intensive, we would significantly reduce our carbon emissions. There are also new farming techniques which can turn soil from a source of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere into a sink. So instead of tilling the land, plowing it up, exposing soil to react with the atmosphere and lose carbon essentially, if you use seed drills or basically circular saw type things that plant seeds without tilling the soil, you becomes a carbon sink. So there are definitely agricultural practices which can make a big difference and ways to improve land, you know, planting forests. But it's a good point. On the other side, my talk has been about preparing for climate impacts in the transportation sector. It is also the case that the transportation sector can do a lot in terms of reducing emissions, and no place better than here. If we can build transit systems that get people out of their cars as much as possible, you know, and or transition to electric vehicles and highly efficient vehicles as much as possible, then that will be a major contribution to reducing emissions.
I just have one more, I guess, comment or question. This is Aaron. So, you know, you're showing maps with sea level rise, and that's assuming that the existing population or built environment stays static and is just inundated, right? And so it would seem to me that just when you look at economies and local economies, they're much more highly reactive to stimuli. And so you could see very quick reactions based on increases in inundation or flood events. So I guess one of the other things that as a long-term planning organization we have to be conscious of is, should we be putting infrastructure into places that could very quickly react to a higher frequency of flood events? Will there be in Atlantic City, right, from an economic perspective, if it's flooded even 3 to 5 times per year? So that's sort of, maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. The evidence so far suggests people really stay put. And actually then they quickly become trapped. There are neighborhoods in Atlantic City which already flood very frequently. We don't hear about them because they're on the poor side of town and on the back bay, and homes, people who most of their equity is in their home, and the home has lost all value. Nothing gets sold, or if it does, it's for $20K. But there's also, fishing village in the Philippines, which sunk a meter in an earthquake, and the kids take math class with the water up to their knees, and all the villagers say, no, this is our home, we're not leaving. So that has tended to be the human reaction so far, has been to stay in place, defend, accommodate. I think it's more like the big Sandy type events that are going to lead people to have another thought. And generally you need, often it takes two for people to think that it's not just a bad streak of luck. So on the other hand, it wouldn't shock me if at some point there was a very sudden kind of market turn, when suddenly it was obvious to everyone that this is happening. I mean, I think the smart people will get out ahead of smart people who have access to the right information will get out ahead of the problem, but I don't see signs of that. It's true, we're only analyzing stuff that's already in place, and we do that as an index, not as a projection of the future, but an index of what fraction of development is threatened. I think populations are continuing to grow. People are, and we did an analysis partnered with Zillow this summer, and in about half of the U.S. states, more new homes, and New Jersey is the worst culprit in this. More new homes are being built in the lowest, riskiest places. So homes are being, not more, but homes are being built in the riskiest, lowest places by the coast at a higher rate than the rest of the state. Now for Sandy, that's mostly for New Jersey, that's mostly Sandy rebuild, but you're seeing that in a lot of other states too. So people haven't gotten it yet, but it doesn't mean that it won't someday happen. I expect places with more wealth will advocate for themselves and find ways to fund protections and hang on longer and defend property values more. And places with fewer resources are really going to face this potential trap where this is where those curves I showed early on, where you kind of double the annual flood risk at a certain level each decade, right? Suddenly things seem okay, and 10 or 20 years later you're trapped. So that's the threat for some of this communities. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Scott.